90 miles from Florida, just another communist challenge.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
What precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, was the installation of Soviet medium-range missiles armed with nuclear weapons in Cuba. I was 10 years old. I asked my mom if there would be a nuclear war, and she said, wait till your father gets home, which for me is a very serious thing. My father was director of weapons systems development for Westinghouse. And I said, Dad, is there going to be a nuclear war? He said, 20 to 30% chance, son. That's a pretty serious condition. And for what? For nothing. A pointless notion that we would destroy the world for no reason at all other than to retaliate. This absurdity of why we'd be willing to make such extreme sacrifices, including destroying our own societies and everyone else's, for an idea that didn't make much sense, has always agitated how I've gone about things, and trying to make sense of this was a very powerful motive. I started university scholarship to study mathematics, and of course this was the late 1960s at Columbia University, and much of the fervor in Berkeley had been transferred to Columbia. And since it was my first experience outside, in the outside world, so to say, I joined it. We were going to change the world.
All the young people who had grown up since World War II were different in their experience than all the people who had grown up before World War II. So that for young people, there was no one in the whole world who represented their future to them.
Margaret Mead was born in 1901. She received a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. She is author of 24 books. She is curator emeritus of ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, professor of anthropology at Columbia.
We were demonstrating, and Margaret Mead came up and said, this is not the way to do it, young men and women. You should be talking to your congressmen, your community leaders, your rabbis, your priests, and trying to effect change through the institutions available, which we thought was bunk. So started screaming at her, and she said, well, young man, if you have something further to discuss, you come up to my office. And that I did. It was a wondrous office up in the tower in the Museum of Natural History, and sort of a turret where we had Harry Shapiro's skulls, hundreds of them in a room in cardboard boxes. Everyone from the Spartacus Revolution to the survivors of the Bounty, Zulu spears and Zuni effigies, and all sorts of trinkets from every corner of the world. Then I started taking her class, started working for her, and then she said, well, could you take some phone calls while I'm away? And I said, sure. Got a call from Andy Warhol. And after that, I thought this was the cat's meow, that anthropology was a cool thing after all. The bench-sitting culture of Manhattan, that was my first field work. It was actually fascinating to hang around with bench sitters in New York City on Broadway all day. And then soon after, I was doing field work in the Middle East when I was 18, 19. Going around the Middle East on a motorcycle and interviewing different groups, trying to figure out what was what. And that sort of got me started. I was with the Maya, finding out about the richness of the spiritual dimension of their relationships with nature. I decided to work more generally on a general theory of religion. I mean, how are religions possible? What are all possible religions? Why are they so adaptive over the course of ages, and why are they unlikely to disappear despite the repeated attempts?
Let's move on to the 70s.
The 70s.
Yet another thing with cheese.
Yeah, sorry. Fettuccine Alfredo. When we first published this recipe, we published it
Hey, it's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash.
There's obviously been a major incident there. And we're
smack into the middle of the World Trade Center.
And then I saw the plane that had crashed into the Trade Center.
And then 9/11 happened while I was finishing up. And I was looking at the reactions to 9/11, and they were really bizarre. All of a sudden, everybody was confusing every Muslim group, Hamas and the Hezbollah, with Al-Qaeda and Jamaat Islami and others. And people were making incredible statements about the nature of Islam, about the clash of civilizations, about all these sorts of things that seemed a little crazy to me. So I started looking into the history of suicide attacks and suicide bombing. And then I decided, well, I better go out into the world and find out whether what I was coming up with by just viewing the psychological literature and the historical literature was right. And so that's what I started to do, and that's how I got into doing what I do with violent extremist groups.